Jim Rickards, how deadly is this thing we just passed that Mike Johnson and Mitch McConnell allowed to pass?
It's awful, Steve. We were talking about the REPO Act. You know, this bill came along. Mike Johnson broke it into 5 parts. Well, forget the border part. That wasn't going anywhere. But he had Taiwan, Israel, Ukraine, and then they said there's this like odd lot, bunch of stuff thrown together. And they talked about TikTok and all that. Well, buried in that was this REPO Act. And everyone was talking about the $61 billion of military aid to Ukraine. I've looked at that. I can talk about that. But I was entirely focused on the REPO Act. The $61 billion doesn't matter. Russia's going to win the war. They're very far along. The Ukrainian front is just collapsing right now. The $61 billion is just to kind of get Ukraine to the election. That's all the White House cares about. I didn't focus very much on that because it doesn't matter. Russia's going to win the war. But the REPO Act has ramifications that go way beyond that. So what it does, it authorizes the President of the United States to seize any Russian assets in U.S. jurisdiction. Now, seize means steal. We already had a freeze. The freeze came on in February 2022. Seizing is stealing them, basically taking them. So it's confiscation. Now, a lot of really interesting subparts of it. One is when you steal it, when you take the money, it goes into something called the Ukraine Support Fund. Okay, who runs the Ukraine Support Fund? Well, they specifically say the State Department, but the Agency for International Development, AID. Everybody who knows anything about Washington, AID has always been a propaganda and financial front for the CIA. They run around like they're the Peace Corps and they say, pro-American stuff. AID is the propaganda and financial front, one of them, for the CIA. Who's the head of AID? Samantha Power, who was Obama's ambassador to the United Nations. Well, she's married to Cass Sunstein, who was the head of the regulatory office in the Obama administration. So it's one of these typical, Washington progressive power couples. She was born in London. She grew up in Ireland, finally made her way to the United States. She's exactly as you described, Steve. She's she's got all the right credentials, Harvard and all that stuff. But she's a warmonger. She is, just as you say, one notch below Victoria Nuland, but fronting for the Obama administration at the United Nations during what? Benghazi? How many fiascos did the Obama administration have? The red line in the sand in Syria. Hey, if you guys use chemical weapons, we're coming in strong. It's a red line. Almost the next day, Assad uses chemical weapons. Biden doesn't do anything, et cetera. So, Obama doesn't do anything. So that was her track record under Obama. With Biden, again, she's back. She's the head of, as I mentioned, AID, but it's just a front for the CIA. So it's more of the same for her. But she's a very seasoned, kind of ultra left-wing progressive, embedded now in the Biden administration.
It's one thing to freeze the assets. It's a whole nother thing to seize the assets, which essentially means stealing the assets, convert them into dollars, and then use them for other purposes. To your knowledge, have we done that before?
We don't steal the assets. There's too much damage to our credit rating, too much damage to our reputation, to the market, et cetera. So that is highly unusual. Not only that, you might do it from gangsters or a cartel or something like that. In a criminal case, with due process of law, you still have the Constitution still applies. Here, there's no due process for violating the Sovereign Immunities Act. And these are assets that were owned by the Central Bank of Russia. It's not some oligarch where we're taking a yacht. Yeah, we've done that too. This is the Central Bank of Russia. Russia is the 11th largest economy in the world, the largest nuclear power, the largest landmass, 9th largest population, major producer of all strategic minerals, etc. It's a huge power. This REPO Act, which you talked about, stealing the assets is bad enough, and we can talk about the implications of that. But there are 2 anti-Trump landmines buried in the statute that whoever wrote it knew what they were doing, but I haven't seen any reporting on it. One is Section 103. It says this freeze, this confiscation will stay in place until the president certifies 2 things. Number one, an end to hostilities. Well, that's never going to happen because they'll say unless you leave unless you leave Crimea, the hostilities are still going on. But the second one is that Russia has visibly and demonstrably paid for all the damage in Ukraine. Well, that's not going to happen either because since when does the winner pay reparations? It's the loser who pays reparations. They've got that backwards as well. So the point is no president, including President Trump, if he wins a second term, can offer that certification, which means that the freeze activity never goes away. There's another provision, Section 104, This I found fascinating. It says the confiscation power that we're talking about has a 5-year sunset. Now, it's not unusual to have sunset provisions. 1 year, 3 years, because Congress likes to revisit these things. Why 5 years? It goes to August 2029, sorry, April 2029, which is after the Trump administration. So they have tied Trump's hands. Let's say Trump wins in November, he'll be out in January 2029. This thing doesn't expire till April 2029. It's engineered in such a way that Trump can't do anything about it during his entire term. And by the way, there's a lot of this going on. Everyone talks about the transition. I would say Trump probably bungled the transition in 2016. There's a lot of effort underway, Heritage and others and yourself, to make sure they do a much better job, get the plum book out, get the 3,000 top jobs. That's underway. But the elites and the Davos crowd, they're looking ahead. They see that Trump could very well win. So they're not waiting until he wins to start sabotaging. They're sabotaging him right now. So Jens Stoltenberg is the General Secretary of NATO. He's proposed a 5-year, $100 billion fund to keep funding the war in Ukraine. Why 5 years? Once again, the 5 years is the magic number because it goes beyond the end of the second Trump administration. So he wants a $100 billion fund. He wants weapons moved from U.S. control to NATO control. So now even if Trump's the commander-in-chief, he's not the commander-in-chief of NATO. He's the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. So they want the weapons put in a NATO bucket. They want $100 billion that goes for 5 years. This REPO Act we just talked about, the sunset provision is 5 years. They see that Trump could very well win, and they're setting up all these landmines that last for 5 years so that even if he's president, he can't do anything about it. Now, here's my question. Mike McCall, who's the chairman, this bill was written in the House. I mean, there was a version of it in the Senate. It came over. The House controlled this, leaving aside the fact that Mike Johnson could have just said, we're not voting on it. He didn't do that, clearly. But this bill was written by Republicans because they control the committees, they control the drafting, et cetera. So the Republicans, or at least a large subset of them, are out to sabotage Trump. And this is the kind of thing, sorry to be a lawyer about this, but I am, and I read these things very closely. These things are what I call Trump landmines. The Davos crowd, the elites, and the rhinos in Congress, the Republicans, and certainly the Democrats, they're out to Trump-proof the world. In other words, rig the game today, not next January, but today, so that Trump's hands are tied before he's even sworn in.
This was a Republican bill written by a Republican House, written by guys like McCall and approved by Johnson and his leadership team. Is that correct, sir? That's
absolutely correct. Even if you want to push the bill, you could have struck those provisions or had a 1-year sunset. A lot you could have done. This is Trump proofing against the fact that Trump might win. They'll tie his hands in advance.
How dangerous is what they just did with this REPO Act?
It's extremely dangerous and far more dangerous than the $61 billion. $61 billion is a waste of money, and you're going to have hundreds of thousands of additional dead Ukrainians that no one in Washington seems to care about, starting with Lindsey Graham. But this REPO Act is more dangerous. Let me be specific. This will diminish and undermine trust in the U.S. respect for the rule of law and the U.S. Treasury market. I'm not saying the Treasury market collapses the next day. I mean, I guess the president signed it today. But at the margin, if you're a country with a large surplus and you got to decide where to put your money, you're going to fade Treasury bills and get into gold. Again, not being a gold bug, I'm just saying gold is something you can't freeze. It's physical. You put it away. You can't touch it. This is going to give a significant boost to the BRICS. I call it BRICS Plus because they've got new members. The BRICS effort to introduce a new, start out as a trading currency and then in time become a reserve currency alternative to the dollar. Again, it doesn't mean the dollar disappears, but it's going to have very strong competition. This is playing out over a couple of years. The third one, and this is much more immediate, if the U.S. goes ahead and steals these assets, and the U.S. only has their hands on about $10 billion. Most of it's in Europe, but $290 billion in Europe, $10 billion in the U.S. But there are members of Congress say to steal the $10 billion now. Don't wait for the Europeans to come along. If they do, but sorry, this is all being set up, by the way, for the G7 conference. The G7 conference is on check the date, June 13th. Okay, so Yellen and Biden want to get this done, and Blinken want to get this done before the G7 conference, because there's another fund called the Common Ukraine Fund. Whereas the U.S. is just sort of saying, well, we'll take the $10 billion and put it in this fund. But there's this bigger fund, the Common Ukraine Fund. We want the $290 billion in that fund You, the Europeans, have to steal from Euroclear, which is the biggest clearing firm in Europe. They have the 200 billion. That's the big prize right there. They're going to steal from Euroclear. Now, if this goes forward, and it is as of now, Russia is going to seize the assets, Western assets in Russia. So BP, Siemens, Total Oil in France, major European countries have huge energy infrastructure, mining, technology, and communications investments in Russia. Putin's going to steal those. My estimate is Putin's going to make a profit on this. They'll take his 300 billion of treasury securities, but he'll take a far larger amount of infrastructure and other technology, et cetera, in Russia that they haven't touched so far. It's still owned by the Europeans. He'll take that. I think Putin will make a profit there. One other thing no one's thought about. So Euroclear, that's this large clearinghouse based in Belgium. It's owned by 78 banks, but the Europeans will be able to put pressure on the banks to steal the assets. Well, Euroclear has offices in Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, Beijing, and Dubai. All Russia has to do is go into any one of those jurisdictions and sue Euroclear for $200 billion because they'll have jurisdiction because they have offices there. You could throw the entire global clearance and financial system into chaos because what's Euroclear going to do? Those juries and courts and judges will be much more sympathetic to Russia. You don't go sue in New York. Go sue in Hong Kong, which is part of communist China. So the point being that Russia will sue Euroclear for the damages and throw the system into turmoil. And finally, this is to me the best irony, is that while the West has been talking about this, what's been happening to the price of gold? It's up $600 an ounce. Russia has 3,000 tons. Russia has made a $50 billion profit on the price of gold without lifting a finger because the West is so threatening. Everyone's like, get me the gold.